The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dust Haven, New Mexico territory, as Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach that had carried her from civilization into what felt like the edge of the world. The year was 1875, and the town sprawled before her like a collection of weathered wooden buildings that had sprouted from the desert floor, defiant against the harsh landscape that surrounded them. Clara adjusted her traveling dress, now covered in a fine layer of dust that seemed to coat everything in this forgotten corner of the territory. At 24, she carried herself with the poise of an educated woman from Boston, though her green eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty as she surveyed her new home. Her auburn hair, pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, caught the morning light as she reached for her worn leather satchel, the one that contained her teaching certificates and the books she'd managed to bring across the country. "This here's Dust Haven, miss," the stagecoach driver announced, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, "though I reckon you might be wondering why anyone would call it a haven." The town's main street stretched before her, flanked by a general store, a blacksmith's shop, 2 saloons, and various other establishments that seemed to lean against each other for support. At the far end, she could make out the small wooden structure that would be her schoolhouse, if the faded sign hanging crookedly above the door was to be believed. As Clara made her way down the street, her Eastern attire drawing stares from the locals, she couldn't help but notice how different this place was from the orderly streets of Boston. Here, horses tied to hitching posts swished their tails against the flies, and men in worn leather chaps and dust-covered hats paused in their activities to watch her pass. Women in simple calico dresses peered from doorways, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice called out from the porch of Murphy's saloon. "Looks like that schoolmarm they've been talking about actually showed up." Clara straightened her spine and continued walking, though she could hear the laughter that followed the comment. She had expected some resistance. The Territorial Education Board had warned her that frontier towns weren't always welcoming to change, but she hadn't anticipated the open mockery. As she approached the schoolhouse, a group of men lounging outside the saloon began to take particular interest. At their center sat Silas Bragg, the son of the town's wealthiest rancher. At 28, Silas had the kind of handsomeness that came with good breeding and plenty of money, though his smile held a cruel edge that made Clara instinctively wary. "Afternoon, miss," Silas called out, tipping his expensive hat with exaggerated courtesy. "You must be the teacher lady from back east, come to civilize us poor, ignorant folk." His companions chuckled, and Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I've come to open the school, Mr. Bragg, Silas Bragg." He stood, his considerable height making her feel even smaller. "And I'm afraid you've wasted your journey. See, we don't much care for book learning out here. What good's readin' and writin' when a man needs to know how to rope a steer or defend his claim? Education is valuable for everyone, Mr. Bragg," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Children deserve the chance to—" "Children need to learn their place," Silas interrupted, his friendly facade dropping for a moment. "Boys need to work the ranches. Girls need to keep house. That's the way it's always been. And that's the way it'll stay." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Silas had already turned back to his friends, dismissing her as easily as one might shoo away a fly. She continued to the schoolhouse, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the key the territory had sent her. The interior of the schoolhouse was even more discouraging than the exterior. Dust covered everything, and several windows were cracked or broken entirely. A few rickety desks sat haphazardly arranged, and the blackboard at the front was so faded she could barely make out the ghostly traces of old lessons. "Lord help me," Clara whispered, setting down her satchel and looking around the neglected space. "What have I gotten myself into?" She spent the rest of the day cleaning, her fine dress soon as dusty as everything else in Dust Haven. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, several times. She glanced out the windows to see townspeople gathered in small groups, clearly discussing the newcomer who thought she could change their ways. As evening approached, Clara made her way to the boarding house where she'd arranged to stay. Mrs. Harrington, the proprietress, was a stern woman in her 50s who looked Clara up and down with obvious disapproval. "You're that teacher, ain't you?" she said, more statement than question. "Room's upstairs, last door on the right, supper's at 6 sharp, breakfast at dawn. No gentlemen callers, no liquor, no trouble." "Of course," Clara agreed, though the warning seemed unnecessary. Who would come calling on the unwelcome schoolteacher? At supper, she found herself seated at a long table with the other boarders, mostly traveling salesmen and a few ranch hands between jobs. The conversation died when she entered, and the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clink of silverware on plates. "Heard you met Silas Bragg today," one of the ranch hands finally said, not looking up from his beans. "Best steer clear of him. Miss, his daddy owns half the territory. And Silas, well, he's got his own ideas about how things should run." "I'm not afraid of Mr. Bragg," Clara said quietly. The ranch hand snorted. "Then you're either brave or foolish. Maybe both." That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town, the distant piano music from the saloons, the occasional whoop of a drunken cowboy, the howl of coyotes in the desert beyond. She thought of her comfortable room in Boston, of the well-appointed school where she'd trained, of her family's tears when she'd announced her decision to go west. "You're throwing your life away," her mother had said. "No decent man will marry a woman who's lived among savages and outlaws." But Clara had felt called to this work, driven by something she couldn't quite name. The frontier needed teachers, needed someone to bring learning to the children who would one day shape this wild land. She'd imagined herself as a pioneer of education, a bringer of light to the darkness. Now, lying in the dark with doubt gnawing at her resolve, she wondered if she'd simply been naive. The next morning, Clara arrived at the schoolhouse early, determined to make it ready for students. She'd posted notices about the school's opening, though she had no idea if anyone would come. As she swept the floor and arranged the desks, she tried to push away the memory of yesterday's mockery. At 8 o'clock sharp, she stood at the door, waiting. The street was quiet, save for the usual morning activities of the town. 9 o'clock came and went, then 10. Not a single child appeared. Just as Clara was about to go inside and contemplate her failure, she heard approaching footsteps. A woman appeared, holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The woman's dress was patched and faded, and she had the worn look of someone who'd known hard times. "Are you the teacher?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes, I'm Miss Whitmore," Clara replied, hope blooming in her chest. "This is my boy, Samuel." The woman nudged the child forward. "He's eager to learn his letters, but—" She glanced around nervously. "My husband doesn't know I've brought him. Says it's foolishness, but I want better for my son than breaking his back in the mines." "Samuel is very welcome," Clara said warmly, kneeling to the boy's level. "Would you like to see the classroom?" The boy nodded shyly, and Clara led them inside. She'd just begun showing Samuel the primers when she heard commotion outside. Through the window, she could see Silas Bragg approaching with several of his friends. "Looks like the schoolmarm found herself a student." Silas called out loudly, "Martha Jenkins, that you in there? Wait till your husband hears about this." The woman paled, grabbing Samuel's hand. "I'm sorry, miss, I can't. I have to go." She hurried out, dragging the confused child behind her. Clara followed them to the door, watching as they scurried away. Silas stood in the street, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. "You might as well pack up and head back east," he said. "Nobody wants you here. Schoolmarm, this town's got no use for your kind of learning." "Everyone has a right to education," Clara said, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. Rights, Silas laughed. Out here, the only rights that matter are the ones you can defend. And from where I'm standing, you can't defend much of anything. As he walked away, his laughter echoing down the street, Clara felt the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She was alone in a hostile town, with no allies and no students. The schoolhouse that had seemed like a beacon of hope now felt like a prison. But as she stood in the doorway, something in the distance caught her eye. A lone rider on a black horse, watching from a ridge overlooking the town. Even from this distance, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Then, as suddenly as she'd noticed him, he turned his horse and disappeared beyond the ridge. Clara shivered, though the morning was already warm. She didn't know who the rider was, but something about that silent observation felt different from the open hostility she'd faced so far, whether it was a threat or something else entirely. She couldn't say. She returned to the empty schoolhouse, sitting at the teacher's desk she'd so carefully cleaned, outside. The life of Dusthaven continued without her, a foreign woman with foreign ideas in a place that seemed determined to reject both. But Clara Whitmore hadn't traveled 2,000 miles to give up after 2 days. She opened her satchel and pulled out her books, arranging them on the desk. If the children wouldn't come to her, perhaps she needed to find another way to reach them. As she planned her next move, she didn't notice the rider had returned to the ridge, a silent sentinel watching over the stubborn teacher who refused to know when she was beaten. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the desert, promising trouble ahead. The afternoon heat pressed down on Dusthaven like a heavy blanket as Clara made her way toward the general store. It had been 3 days since the incident with Samuel Jenkins, and she'd spent that time trying different approaches, visiting homes, speaking with mothers at the well, even attempting to engage children playing in the streets. Each effort had been met with the same result: nervous glances, hurried excuses, and warnings about Silas Bragg. Clara pushed open the door to Henderson's general store, the bell above tinkling her arrival. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger with surprise. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully. "What can I do for you?" "I need supplies for the schoolhouse," Clara said, producing a list. "Chalk ink, perhaps some paper if you have it." Henderson glanced toward the window nervously. "I'm not sure that's wise. Miss Folk around here, they don't take kindly to changes." "I'm not asking the town to change. Mr. Henderson, I'm simply offering education to those who want it." "Want's got nothing to do with it," a gruff voice said from the back of the store. Clara turned to see a weathered woman emerging from behind the fabric bolts. "You think we don't want better for our young'uns? Course we do, but wanting and getting are 2 different things in Dusthaven." "I don't understand," Clara said. "If parents want their children educated—" "You really don't know nothing, do you?" The woman shook her head. "Silas Bragg's daddy owns the biggest ranch in the territory. Half the men in this town work for him, one way or another. The other half depend on his business. You cross the Braggs, you might as well pack up and leave." Clara felt frustration building in her chest. So everyone just accepts this. No one stands up to them. The woman's laugh was bitter. "Stand up to them, girl. The last fellow who tried that ended up finding his well poisoned and his cattle scattered to the 4 winds. Most folk learned their lesson after that." Clara was about to respond when a commotion outside caught her attention. Through the store window, she could see a crowd gathering in the street. At the center of it, Silas Bragg and his men had surrounded someone, a young Mexican boy who couldn't have been more than 12. "Caught this little thief red-handed," Silas was saying loudly. "Trying to steal from honest folk." "I wasn't stealing," the boy protested. "I was just looking." Clara rushed outside, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on here?" Silas's eyes lit up when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmarm, come to defend another lost cause." "I asked what's happening," Clara repeated, moving closer to the frightened boy. "This boy was caught outside my father's ranch, probably fixing to steal horses," Silas said. We handle thieves harshly out here."
"I wasn't stealing nothing,"
the boy said again, tears streaming down his face.
"I was looking for my papa's horse. It wandered off."
"A likely story," one of Silas's men sneered. Clara stepped between the boy and his accusers.
"You have no proof he was stealing anything. You can't just—"
"Can't what?" Silas moved closer, towering over her. "Can't protect what's ours, can't maintain order. Maybe that's how they do things in Boston. But out here—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut him off. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching on a black stallion, moving with unhurried purpose down the main street. Clara recognized him immediately. It was the same man she'd seen watching from the ridge. As he drew closer, she could make out his features. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were practical worn leather vest over a faded shirt, dark pants, and boots that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray like storm clouds, holding a weariness that seemed beyond his years. The crowd parted as he rode through, and Clara noticed how even Silas's men stepped back. The rider brought his horse to a stop near the confrontation, his gaze moving from Silas to the boy to Clara.
"Afternoon,"
he said, his voice low and graveled.
"Seems like a lot of fuss for a Tuesday."
"None of your concern. Cole," Silas said, though Clara noticed he'd lost some of his swagger. "Just handling a thief." The man, Cole, dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "Miguel Reyes's boy, isn't it?" he asked, looking at the child. "Your papa's mare is back at my place. Showed up this morning, probably chasing after my stallion again." The boy's eyes widened with hope. "Really, Senor Cole?" "Would I lie?" Cole turned to Silas. "Seems like there's been a misunderstanding." "The boy was on Bragland," Silas insisted, though his argument had lost its force. "Following a horse," Cole said simply. "No crime in that." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and Clara could feel the tension crackling between them. Finally, Silas stepped back. "Fine," he said. "But next time might be different." He turned to Clara. "And you, schoolmarm, you'd best learn to mind your own business." As Silas and his men departed, the crowd began to disperse. The Mexican boy mumbled a quick gracias before running off, presumably to find his father and reclaim their horse. Clara found herself alone with the man called Cole. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting into too many desert suns. There was a scar on his left hand, and his posture suggested someone always ready for trouble. "Thank you," she said, "for helping that boy." Cole looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt oddly exposed under that steady gaze. "You're the teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. "Clara Whitmore." She offered her hand, then withdrew it awkwardly when he didn't take it. "You should go back east," he said bluntly. "This isn't a place for you." The dismissal stung more than she cared to admit.
"I've heard that opinion already, Mr. Cole, several times. In fact—"
"It's just Cole," he said. "And it's not an opinion. It's advice."
"Well, I don't recall asking for your advice."
Clara lifted her chin.
"I came here to teach,
and that's what I intend to do." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe respect. Silas Bragg isn't someone to cross lightly. His father owns half this territory, and Silas, he's got ambitions of his own.
"I'm not afraid of bullies,"
Clara said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Then you're a fool," Cole said, but there was no harshness in it. He gathered his horse's reins. "Bravery and foolishness look the same until one of them gets you killed." He mounted his horse and looked down at her. "You want some different advice? Learn to shoot. Out here, principles don't stop bullets." With that, he touched the brim of his hat and rode away, leaving Clara standing in the dusty street. She watched him go, noting the way people stepped aside, the mixture of respect and wariness in their faces. Whoever Cole was, he commanded a different kind of attention than Silas Bragg.
"You best be careful around that one,"
a voice said. Clara turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing nearby.
"Ethan Cole's got a darkness in him. Lost his wife to raiders some years back. Lives alone out on that horse ranch. Doesn't come to town much except for supplies."
"He helped that boy," Clara pointed out.
"Oh, he's not a bad man,"
Mrs. Henderson clarified. "Just a damaged one, and damaged men can be unpredictable." That evening, Clara sat in her room at the boarding house, replaying the day's events. She'd learned several things. Silas Bragg's power came from his father's wealth and the town's economic dependence. The townspeople wanted education for their children but feared the consequences. And Ethan Cole, the mysterious rancher who lived on the edges of society, might be the only person in Dust Haven who wasn't afraid of the Braggs. She pulled out paper and began writing a letter to the Territorial Education Board, updating them on the challenges she faced. Halfway through, she stopped. What would they do? Send another teacher to face the same opposition, close the school permanently? No, this was her battle to fight. Instead, she began making a new plan. If the children couldn't come to the school, perhaps she could find other ways to reach them. She thought of the boy today, Miguel Reyes's son. Were there other Mexican families in the area who might be less beholden to the Braggs? What about the very poor, those who had nothing left to lose? As she planned, her thoughts kept drifting to Ethan Cole, the way he'd faced down Silas without raising his voice or hand, the sadness in his eyes when he'd warned her about principles and bullets. Mrs. Henderson had called him damaged, but Clara had seen something else. A man who still chose to do right, even if he no longer believed in much of anything. The next morning, Clara set out early, heading toward the poorer section of town where the Mexican and mixed families lived. She carried her books and supplies, determined to find at least one student willing to learn. She was knocking on doors when she heard horses approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized Silas Bragg's voice. But when she turned, she was surprised to see he wasn't looking at her. His attention was fixed on a dust cloud in the distance. Ethan Cole was driving a small group of horses toward town, and even from a distance, Clara could see they were magnificent animals. As he drew closer, she noticed a young boy riding beside him, the same boy from yesterday.
"Teaching the Reyes boy to steal horses now, Cole,"
Silas called out. Ethan reined in his mount. "Teaching him to train them. His father's working for me now. Legitimate work, in case you're wondering." Clara watched this exchange with interest. So Ethan had hired the boy's father, probably to protect the family from further harassment. "You can't protect everyone who crosses us," Silas warned. "Not trying to," Ethan replied.
"Just running my ranch."
His eyes flickered to Clara for a moment. "Everyone's got a right to make an honest living." As Ethan and the boy continued toward the stockyards, Silas turned his attention back to Clara. "And what are you doing in this part of town, schoolmarm?"
"Looking for students,"
Clara said simply. "These people don't need your kind of learning," Silas said. "They're laborers, servants. Teaching them to read will just give them ideas above their station."
Everyone deserves. What everyone deserves and what they get are two different things."
Silas interrupted. "You keep pushing, Miss Whitmore, and you might find out just how different." After he left, Clara stood in the dusty street, weighing her options. She could leave, go back to Boston where schools were established and valued, or she could stay and fight, knowing the odds were against her. Her eyes found Ethan Cole in the distance, still working with the horses, a damaged man who still chose to help when he could. Maybe that was all anyone could do, choose to do right, even when the world seemed set against it, with renewed determination. Clara knocked on the next door. She would find her students, one family at a time if necessary, and perhaps in this harsh land where principles seemed as fleeting as desert rain, she might find allies in the most unexpected places. The widow Garza, who answered the door, had 3 children peering out from behind her skirts. When Clara explained her purpose, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "You would teach my children even though we have no money. Education should be free to all," Clara said firmly. As she was invited inside, Clara couldn't help but glance back toward the stockyards. Ethan Cole was still there, patient with the boy, teaching him about horses. 2 teachers, she thought, in their own different ways. Perhaps Dust Haven wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by the weekly mail coach that connected Dust Haven to the outside world. Clara recognized the official seal of the Territorial Education Board before she even opened it, and her heart sank as she read the terse message within. "Miss Whitmore," it began. "We have received concerning reports about the lack of enrollment at the Dust Haven School, as per our agreement. Maintaining a minimum of 12 regular students is required to justify the territorial funding. You have 6 weeks to meet this requirement, or we will be forced to permanently close the institution and redirect resources elsewhere." Clara set the letter down with trembling hands. In the 3 weeks since she'd begun teaching the Garza children and a handful of other Mexican families in secret locations, she'd managed to gather only 7 students. They met in barns, in homes, wherever they could avoid Silas Bragg's notice. But 7 wasn't 12, and official enrollment was impossible when families feared public association with the school. She was still staring at the letter when Mrs. Harrington knocked on her door. "You have a visitor, Miss Whitmore. Says it's about the school." Clara hurried downstairs, hoping for a parent willing to enroll their child. Instead, she found Ethan Cole standing in the parlor, looking uncomfortable in the formal space. His hat was in his hands, and he turned it slowly as he waited. "Mr. Cole," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Heard you might be needing this," he said, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "Miguel Reyes asked me to bring it. He wants to officially enroll his boy, Carlos." Clara took the enrollment form with shaking hands. "But won't this cause trouble for them?" "Already told Silas that Miguel works for me now," Ethan said. "Man's got a right to educate his son. Silas pushes the issue. He pushes against me." "Why would you do this?" Clara asked, searching his face. "You told me to leave town." "Still think you should," he said bluntly. "But you're not going to, are you?" "No." He nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Then you should know what you're really up against. Mind if I sit?" Clara gestured to a chair, taking one across from him. In the daylight filtering through lace curtains, she could see more clearly the lines of old pain etched into his features. "Silas isn't just being contrary," Ethan began. "His father, William Bragg, has plans for this town. Big plans. There's talk of the railroad maybe coming through in a few years. When it does, land prices will soar. Bragg's been buying up property cheap, forcing out anyone who won't sell." "What does that have to do with the school?" "Educated people ask questions. They read contracts, understand laws. They're harder to cheat and intimidate. Keep the population ignorant, and you can control them easier." Ethan's gray eyes were serious. "That schoolhouse sits on a prime piece of land. Silas has got his eye on it for a hotel and gaming house. Can't build it if there's a functioning school there." Clara felt a chill despite the warm morning. "So this isn't just about tradition or stubborn prejudice. It's about money. Always is." Ethan stood. "I've said my piece. You know what you're fighting now. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to keep teaching," Clara said firmly. "I have 7 students now, 8 with Carlos. I need 12 to keep the school funded." "Might know a few others," Ethan said slowly. "Families that work their own land don't depend on Bragg. Can't promise anything, but I'll ask." "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked again. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. "My wife, Sarah, she could read and write. Taught herself, then taught me. Used to say education was the only thing nobody could take from you.
He put on his hat. She would have liked you. Miss Whitmore would have been first in line to help with that school.
Before Clara could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing in the parlor with the enrollment form and a new understanding of both the challenges she faced and the unexpected ally she'd found. That afternoon, Clara made her way to the small adobe house where she'd been meeting with the Garza children. As she taught them basic arithmetic, her mind kept returning to Ethan's revelations. She'd thought she was fighting ignorance and tradition. Instead, she was standing in the way of a calculated business plan.
Miss Clara,
young Maria Garza said,
why do we have to hide to learn?
Clara looked at the 8-year-old's earnest face and struggled for an answer.
Sometimes, people are afraid of change.
Maria, but that doesn't mean we stop learning.
My papa says Mr. Bragg doesn't want us to be smart.
Maria's older brother, Juan, added,
says smart Mexicans cause trouble.
The only trouble education causes, Clara said carefully,
is for those who profit from ignorance.
After the lesson, Clara was gathering her books when she heard horses approaching. Her heart raced, fearing Silas had discovered their meeting place, but when she peered out the window, she saw Ethan Cole with 2 riders she didn't recognize. She stepped outside cautiously. Ethan dismounted and gestured to his companions.
Miss Whitmore, this is Tom Morrison and Jack Sullivan. They ranch north of here. Told them about the school.
Morrison, a weathered man in his 40s, spoke first.
Got 3 young'uns. Wife's been teaching them what she can, but she only got through 3rd grade herself. If you're willing to take them on.
Of course, Clara said quickly.
I'd be honored.
Sullivan, younger and clearly more nervous, added,
Got 2 boys myself, but if Bragg comes calling.
He'll answer to me, Ethan said quietly.
Any man troubles you for sending your children to school. You send them my way.
Clara watched this interaction with fascination.
Ethan Cole might live on the margins of society, but he commanded respect. These men trusted his word, his protection.
After Morrison and Sullivan left with enrollment forms,
Clara turned to Ethan. That's 13 students now, counting theirs. More than enough to satisfy the board.
Don't celebrate yet, Ethan warned.
Silas won't take this quietly. You've got your students, but keeping them might be another matter.
His prediction proved accurate.
The next day,
Clara arrived at the official schoolhouse to find the windows smashed and the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the desks were overturned, and crude messages were scrawled across her carefully cleaned blackboard. She was standing among the wreckage when she heard footsteps.
Sheriff Dixon, a man clearly in Bragg's pocket, surveyed the damage with feigned concern.
Terrible thing, he said, not meeting her eyes.
Vandals, probably. Maybe some drifters passing through. Drifters who specifically targeted the school.
Clara's voice was sharp.
How convenient.
Now,
Miss, I don't like what you're implying. Without evidence.
Of course, Clara said bitterly.
No evidence.
The sheriff left, and Clara began the tedious process of cleaning up. She was sweeping broken glass when she heard more footsteps. This time, it was Ethan. He surveyed the damage silently, then began helping her right the overturned desks. They worked together without speaking for several minutes before he said,
Sarah and I had plans once. She wanted to start a school on our ranch. Had it all figured out? How to make it work, who to teach, everything.
Clara paused in her sweeping.
What happened?
Raiders hit while I was away with the army. Burned everything, including... He stopped, jaw tight. I found her in what was left of the barn. She'd tried to save the horses.
I'm so sorry,
Clara whispered.
After that, I stopped believing in plans, in building things. What's the point when someone can just come along and destroy it all?
He set another desk upright. But watching you, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the building is the point, even if it doesn't last. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Your wife sounds like she was remarkable.
She was.
Ethan moved to the broken window, looking out at the town. Silas did this, but you'll never prove it. Next time might be worse. Then I need to be ready. Clara said, You mentioned learning to shoot. Ethan turned to her, surprised. You're serious? If I'm going to stay and fight, I need to be able to protect myself and my students. Shooting a gun isn't like teaching arithmetic. Miss Whitmore, it changes you. This place is already changing me. Clara admitted, I might as well choose how. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Tomorrow morning, then dawn. I'll teach you, but we do it my way, and not here at my ranch. Less chance of interference. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about the path she was choosing. She'd come west to be a teacher, and now she was planning to learn gunfighting. Her mother would be horrified. But as she thought about her students, the hope in their eyes, their eagerness to learn, she knew she couldn't abandon them. The next morning, she rose before dawn and made her way to the edge of town, where Ethan waited with an extra horse. They rode in silence as the sky lightened, the desert landscape taking on an otherworldly beauty in the early light. Ethan's ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house and several corrals holding magnificent horses. He led her to an area behind the barn where targets were set up. First rule, he said, handing her a revolver. Never point this at anything you don't intend to destroy. A gun isn't a threat or a negotiation. It's a final answer. For the next 2 hours, he taught her how to hold the weapon, how to aim, how to control her breathing. Clara's arms ached and her ears rang, but she persisted. By the end, she could hit the target more often than not. You're a quick study, Ethan said, and she heard approval in his voice. But hitting a target isn't the same as facing down a man who means you harm. Pray you never have to learn the difference. As they rode back to town, Clara felt the weight of the pistol Ethan had insisted she keep. It was Sarah's, he'd said simply. She'd want it used to protect something worthwhile. They were nearing town when they saw smoke rising. Clara's heart clenched as she recognized the location, the Garza house. She spurred her horse forward, Ethan close behind. They arrived to find the small adobe house in flames, the family huddled outside. No one was hurt, but everything they owned was burning. They came in masks. Mrs. Garza sobbed. Said this is what happens when we forget our place. Clara dismounted and wrapped her arms around the woman, rage burning as hot as the flames. She looked at Ethan and saw her own anger reflected in his eyes. Enough, she said. This ends now. What are you planning? Ethan asked. I'm going to open that school properly. In the schoolhouse, in broad daylight. No more hiding. She turned to the gathered families who'd come to help fight the fire. Classes start Monday morning, 8 o'clock sharp. Anyone who wants to learn is welcome. They'll come for you, someone warned. Let them, Clara said, her hand moving unconsciously to the pistol at her side. I'm done being afraid. As the flames died down and the community rallied to help the Garza family, Clara noticed Ethan watching her with something new in his expression. Not just respect now, but recognition. She'd crossed a line, made a choice that would define everything that came next. The schoolteacher from Boston was gone. In her place stood something harder, forged by desert sun and tested by fire. Whatever came next, Clara Whitmore would meet it head-on. The storm announced itself with a wall of dust that turned the afternoon sky an ominous brown. Clara had seen dust storms before in her weeks at Dust Haven, but nothing like this. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the schoolhouse windows as her 13 students huddled closer to their desks. Everyone stay calm, Clara said, though her own heart raced. She'd dismissed class early when she'd seen the storm building, but several parents hadn't arrived yet to collect their children. We'll wait it out here. The schoolhouse is sturdy. Young Maria Garza whimpered as something heavy struck the side of the building. Clara moved to comfort her when the door burst open, sand and wind rushing in like an invasion. She struggled to push it closed, but the force was too strong.
Get under the desks, she shouted over the roar. Cover your faces.
The children scrambled to obey as Clara fought with the door. The sand stung her eyes, filled her mouth, made breathing difficult. Just as her strength began to fail, stronger hands joined hers. Ethan Cole had appeared from the storm like a ghost, his hat gone, his face covered with a bandana. Together they forced the door shut and barred it. Ethan immediately began checking the windows, reinforcing them with chairs and desks. Clara noticed blood on his shirt. "You're hurt," she said. "Flying debris," he said shortly. "Are all the children here?" Clara did a quick count, her heart stopping. "Carlos Reyes is missing. He left just before—" Without hesitation, Ethan headed for the door. "Which way?" "You can't go out in that," Clara protested. "Boys probably took shelter at the church. It's closer to his home." He rewrapped his bandana. "Keep everyone here. Don't open this door for anyone but me." Before Clara could argue, he was gone, swallowed by the brown maelstrom. She turned back to her students, trying to project calm despite her fear. The storm raged on, and with each passing minute, her worry grew. She had the children sing songs to pass the time and distract from the howling wind. But her eyes kept returning to the door, willing it to open, willing Ethan to return with Carlos safe. Nearly an hour passed before she heard pounding on the door. "It's Cole, open up!" Clara rushed to remove the bar, and Ethan stumbled in carrying Carlos, both of them caked in dust and sand. The boy was conscious but clearly terrified, clinging to Ethan's neck. "Found him trapped under an overturned wagon," Ethan said, setting the boy down gently. "Few cuts and bruises, but he'll be fine." As Clara tended to Carlos, she noticed Ethan's condition. His shirt was torn in several places, revealing gashes from flying debris. His hands were raw from digging, and he moved stiffly, obviously in pain. "Sit down," she ordered. "You need attention too." "I'm fine," he said, but swayed slightly. "Sit," Clara repeated firmly, and to her surprise, he obeyed. As she cleaned his wounds with water from the drinking bucket, she was acutely aware of his proximity. This was the closest they'd been, and despite the circumstances, she noticed things. The way his jaw tightened when she touched a particularly deep cut, the calluses on his hands from years of hard work, the way he watched her with those storm-gray eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing Carlos back." "You would have done the same," he said. "I would have tried, but I probably would have gotten lost and made things worse." She wrapped a torn piece of her petticoat around a deep gash on his arm. "You knew exactly where to look." "Sarah and I weathered plenty of storms together," he said quietly. "You learn the patterns, where people seek shelter." The mention of his late wife should have created distance between them, but somehow it didn't. Instead, Clara felt honored that he shared these memories with her. The storm began to abate as evening approached. Parents arrived in waves, clutching their children with relief. Miguel Reyes nearly wept when he saw Carlos safe, pumping Ethan's hand in gratitude. Soon, only Clara and Ethan remained in the schoolhouse. The building had held, though sand covered everything and would take days to clean. As they surveyed the damage together, Clara became aware of a shift between them, something unspoken but undeniable. "You should get home," she said. "Those wounds need proper tending." "What about you?" "I'll clean up a bit here first." "Not alone. You won't. Not after dark." His tone brooked no argument. "Silas has been too quiet since you announced the school would stay open. This storm provides good cover for mischief." They worked together in companionable silence, sweeping sand and setting things to rights as much as possible. As they worked, Clara found herself stealing glances at him, noting the efficient way he moved despite his injuries, the quiet strength he radiated. When they finally locked up and stepped outside, the town looked transformed. Sand drifts leaned against buildings like snow. and the air still tasted of dust. Ethan walked her to the boarding house, their boots crunching on the sand-covered street. "Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. She stopped, turning to face him in the dim light of the covered walkway. "What you did today, keeping those children calm, keeping them safe. Sarah would have done the same thing." "Ethan," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only knowing that something needed to be said. But he was already stepping back, touching his hat brim. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." She watched him walk away, favoring his left side where the worst cuts were. Only when he disappeared into the darkness did she realize she'd wanted him to stay. The next morning brought a new crisis. Clara arrived at the schoolhouse to find Sheriff Dixon waiting with an official-looking document. "Building inspector says the structure's unsafe after the storm," Dixon said, not meeting her eyes. "School's closed until repairs are made." "Building inspector," Clara snatched the paper. "Since when does Dusthaven have a building inspector?" "Since Mr. Bragg appointed one yesterday." Dixon shrugged. "Sorry, Miss, law's the law." Clara read the document, fury building with each word. The violations were ridiculous. Loose floorboards that didn't exist. Structural damage that was purely cosmetic. It was clearly a delaying tactic. "How long for these repairs?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Inspector says at least 6 weeks, maybe more." 6 weeks, exactly the time she had left to maintain enrollment for the territorial board. Without classes, families would drift away. Children would forget their lessons, and the school would close by default. After Dixon left, Clara stood in front of the barred schoolhouse, fists clenched. She'd come too far to be stopped by bureaucratic trickery. But what could she do? She couldn't force the issue without being arrested. "Heard you might need a new location," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Ethan on horseback, leading a saddled mare. "The school's closed," she said bitterly. "The building's closed," he corrected. "Nothing says you can't hold school elsewhere." He gestured to the mare. "Thought you might want to see my ranch again. Got a barn that's mostly empty. Roof's solid. Plenty of space." Hope bloomed in Clara's chest. "You'd let me use your barn." "Already started clearing it out. Tom Morrison and Jack Sullivan are spreading the word. If you're willing, we can have classes running by tomorrow." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you keep helping me?" Ethan dismounted, approaching her slowly. "That first day, when Silas was giving you grief, you stood your ground, reminded me that standing for something matters, even when the odds are against you." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "You remind me there's still things worth fighting for." Without thinking, Clara stepped forward and embraced him. She felt him stiffen in surprise. Then slowly, carefully, his arms came around her. They stood that way for just a moment before propriety reasserted itself and they stepped apart. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice unsteady. "Better get moving if we want that barn ready," Ethan said, but she caught the slight roughness in his voice. They spent the day transforming Ethan's barn into a makeshift schoolhouse. Other families arrived to help. The Morrisons, the Sullivans, the Garza family, and others Clara had never met. They brought boards for makeshift desks, donated a small blackboard, and strung lanterns for light. As Clara watched the community come together, she realized something had shifted. She was no longer the outsider fighting alone. The storm that had threatened to destroy everything had instead revealed the connections she'd built, the lives she'd touched. "It's perfect," she said as they surveyed the completed space. "It's a barn," Ethan said dryly. "It's a school," Clara corrected. "A place where children will learn, where futures will be shaped. The building doesn't matter. It's what happens inside that counts." As families began to leave, promising their children would attend the next morning, Clara noticed storm clouds building again on the horizon. But these weren't dust clouds. This was rain, the kind the desert desperately needed. We should get you back to town before that hits, Ethan said. They rode slowly, neither seeming eager to end the day. The first drops began to fall as they reached the boarding house. Clara dismounted but didn't immediately go inside.
"Ethan," she said as he turned to leave, "what you said about finding things worth fighting for. You helped me remember why I came here in the first place.
It wasn't just to teach. It was to matter, to make a difference. You're doing that," he said simply.
"So are you."
She took a breath, gathering courage. "We make a good team." In the growing darkness, she couldn't read his expression, but she heard something shift in his voice. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "We do." The rain began in earnest then, and Clara hurried inside. From her window, she watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the storm. But for the first time since arriving in Dust Haven, she didn't feel alone. Tomorrow, she would teach in a barn on a horse ranch, protected by a man who'd lost everything but still chose to stand for what was right. It wasn't what she'd planned, but increasingly, Clara was learning that the best things in life rarely were. As thunder rolled across the desert and rain drummed on the roof, Clara prepared her lessons for the next day. Whatever Silas Bragg tried next, she would be ready. She had her students, she had her community, and she had Ethan Cole. For now, that was enough. The attack came at dusk, when the desert sky bled crimson and purple across the horizon. Clara had just finished the day's lessons in Ethan's barn, watching her students head home with their families, when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. "Get inside the house," Ethan ordered sharply, appearing from the stable with his rifle. "Now!" But Clara stood frozen as a dozen riders appeared, led by Silas Bragg himself. They weren't his usual companions. These men had the hard look of hired guns, their faces weathered by violence rather than honest work. Well, Silas drawled, remaining mounted while his men spread out in a semicircle. The schoolmarm and her protector, how cozy. "You're on my land, Bragg," Ethan said evenly, though Clara noticed how his hand rested on his weapon. "State your business or move on." "My business," Silas laughed, an ugly sound. "My business is with her." He pointed at Clara. "You've caused enough trouble. Woman, time to end this charade."
"The only charade here is you pretending to be anything more than a bully," Clara said, finding her voice despite her fear.
Silas's face darkened. "Watch your tongue. You're a long way from Boston society now." "Leave her be," Ethan warned, stepping partially in front of Clara. "Or what? Cole, you'll play hero. We both know how that ended last time." Silas's cruel smile widened.
"How is that wife of yours? Anyway."
Ethan went rigid, and Clara saw his knuckles whiten on the rifle stock. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "That's enough," a new voice called out. Tom Morrison and Jack Sullivan rode up, followed by several other local ranchers. "Evening, Silas. Seems like you're a bit far from home." "This isn't your concern, Morrison," Silas snarled. "A dozen armed men surrounding a woman and a school, I'd say that concerns all of us." Morrison's hand rested casually on his pistol. "Maybe you boys should head back to town." For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Then Silas yanked his reins, causing his horse to rear. "This isn't over," he spat. "That barn won't stand forever, and neither will any of you who stand with her." After they left, Clara found herself trembling. Ethan's hand on her elbow steadied her. "They'll be back," Morrison said grimly, "and with more than threats next time." "Let them come," Ethan said, his voice hard as granite. But Clara heard what the others missed, the pain beneath the anger. After the ranchers left with promises to keep watch, she followed Ethan into the house. "What did he mean?" she asked quietly. "About your wife." Ethan stood at the window, watching the darkness. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then,
so quietly she almost missed it. The raiders who killed Sarah, they were hired, never could prove it. But I knew someone wanted our land, wanted us gone.
Silas?
Clara breathed. His father, most likely. Silas was younger then, but the same kind of poison runs in both of them. He turned to face her, and the raw grief in his eyes made her heart clench. I failed to protect her once. I won't fail again.
This isn't the same.
Isn't it?
He moved closer, intensity radiating from him. A woman who stands up to them, who threatens their control, they'll come for you just like they came for her. Then we'll be ready, Clara said firmly.
I won't run, Ethan. Not from them. Not from this.
Stubborn woman, he muttered,
but there was something like admiration in it.
Stubborn man, she countered, which drew the ghost of a smile. The next morning brought a new crisis. Clara arrived at the barn to find little Anna Morrison crying, a bruise darkening her cheek. Her mother, Ellen, looked haggard with worry.
What happened?
Clara knelt beside the 7-year-old.
Some boys in town, Ellen said tightly. Called her names for coming to the Mexican school. Said their fathers told them she was a traitor.
Clara felt fury rise in her chest.
Bad enough that Silas targeted her, but the children.
Where's Tom? Ethan asked, having overheard.
Gone to town to have words with their fathers,
Ellen said.
I'm afraid of what might happen. Clara made a decision. Class continues as normal, she announced to the gathered families. We won't let fear or hatred stop us from learning.
But concentration was difficult. Every sound outside made them jump. When hoofbeats approached at midday, several parents reached for weapons. It was Sheriff Dixon, looking uncomfortable as always when forced to do Bragg's bidding.
Miss Whitmore, I need you to come with me.
On what charges? Ethan demanded, stepping forward.
Corrupting the youth, operating an illegal school,
disturbing the peace. Dixon couldn't meet their eyes. Mister, Bragg filed formal complaints.
Those are ridiculous charges, Clara said.
Maybe so, but you'll need to answer them before Judge Harley. Dixon shifted nervously.
Today?
Clara knew Judge Harley by reputation. Another man in Bragg's pocket?
This was a trap, pure and simple.
I'll come, she said, ignoring Ethan's protest.
Let me gather my things.
In the barn, she quickly assigned lessons for the older children to lead.
Keep learning,
she told them,
no matter what happens.
The ride to town felt like a funeral procession. Ethan rode beside the sheriff's wagon, his presence a silent threat to anyone who might try something. Other families followed, creating an unlikely parade. The courthouse was packed. It seemed half the town had turned out, curiosity overcoming caution. Silas sat in the front row, satisfaction written across his face. Judge Harley, a thin man who perpetually looked like he'd bitten into something sour, barely glanced at Clara.
Miss Whitmore, you stand accused of operating a school without proper permits, corrupting impressionable youth with dangerous ideas, and creating public disturbances. How do you plead?
Not guilty, Clara said clearly.
And I'd like to know what dangerous ideas I'm accused of teaching.
Reading arithmetic history. You've been teaching Mexican children alongside white children, the judge said, as if this explained everything. Filling their heads with notions of equality that have no place in proper society.
I've been teaching children,
Clara corrected. All children who wish to learn. Furthermore, the judge continued, ignoring her. You've been conducting these lessons on private property without proper authorization, in a building not designated for educational purposes, because the actual schoolhouse was closed on false pretenses. Order, Harley banged his gavel. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt.
Clara bit her tongue, recognizing the futility. This wasn't about justice. It was theater, designed to give legal cover to what Silas wanted anyway.
Given the serious nature of these charges, Harley intoned, I have no choice but to— Your Honor. A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned as an elderly Mexican man stood up in the back. Clara recognized him. Don Alejandro Vega, one of the original settlers of the region. I wish to speak on Miss Whitmore's behalf, Don Alejandro said in accented but perfect English.
This is highly irregular,
Harley protested. As is this trial, Don Alejandro countered. I have lived in this valley for 60 years. I have seen it grow from nothing to what it is today. And I tell you now, this woman has done more for our community in 2 months than others have done in decades. Sit down, old man, Silas started to say, but Don Alejandro wasn't finished. My grandfather was a teacher in Spain. He used to say that those who fear education are those who profit from ignorance. His dark eyes fixed on Silas. What do you fear? Senor Bragg. That these children might grow up to read the contracts you offer, that they might understand the laws you bend. A murmur ran through the crowd. Other voices began to speak up, parents whose children Clara taught, ranchers who'd seen the positive changes, even some townspeople who'd initially opposed her. Judge Harley pounded his gavel frantically. Order, order! But the dam had broken. Years of resentment against the Bragg's control found voice in defense of the schoolteacher who dared to stand against them. Enough, Silas stood, his face red with rage. You want to see what happens to those who defy us? Fine. He stormed out, followed by his men. The threat in his departure was clear. Harley, looking shaken, quickly dismissed the charges pending further investigation and fled to his chambers. Outside the courthouse, Clara found herself surrounded by supporters, but Ethan's face was grim. This isn't a victory, he said quietly. Silas won't forget this humiliation. As if to underscore his words, smoke began rising from the direction of Ethan's ranch. Without a word, he vaulted onto his horse and rode hard, Clara and others following. They arrived to find the barn in flames, the makeshift school consumed by fire. Men with torches were riding away, not even bothering to hide their identity. No! Clara ran toward the building, but Ethan caught her. It's too late, he said, holding her as she struggled. It's gone. Clara watched through tears as weeks of work, the children's drawings and primers, her carefully collected books, all turned to ash. The families who'd followed stood in shocked silence. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I brought this on all of you. No, Ellen Morrison said firmly. They brought this on themselves. She's right, Tom added. They want us to give up, to go back to being afraid, not anymore. Don Alejandro stepped forward. My hacienda has a large hall. It has been empty too long. It would honor me if you would use it for your school. Miss Whitmore. They'll just burn that too, Clara said defeatedly. Let them try, the old man said with steel in his voice. The Vega family has defended that hacienda for 3 generations. We will not yield to cowards with torches. As the fire died down, leaving only smoking ruins, Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw determination replacing fear, community replacing isolation. Tomorrow, she said, her voice growing stronger. Classes resume at Hacienda Vega, 8 o'clock sharp. Clara, Ethan said warningly, but she turned to him with fire in her eyes that matched the one still smoldering behind them. They burned a building. Ethan, they can't burn what we've built here, the connections, the knowledge, the hope. That barn was just wood and nails. This, she gestured to the gathered families. This is what they truly fear. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd best be ready. This was just the beginning. As the crowd dispersed with promises to spread the word, Clara stood with Ethan watching the last of their barn collapse. She thought of all they'd lost, but also of what they'd gained. The fire had been meant to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger. Thank you, she said quietly. For the barn, for everything. It was just a building.
He echoed her earlier words, but she heard the loss in his voice. This had been Sarah's place too. Impulsively, she took his hand. "We'll rebuild. Not the same, but something new, something better." His fingers tightened around hers. "Together." "Together," she confirmed. Behind them, the embers glowed in the darkness. But ahead, the first stars were beginning to appear. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just truly begun. But Clara no longer faced it alone. She had Ethan, she had her community, and she had a purpose that no amount of intimidation could destroy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, standing hand in hand with a man who understood loss and still chose hope, Clara felt ready for whatever came next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza as the people of Dusthaven gathered in unprecedented numbers. Word had spread through the night like wildfire. Silas Bragg had finally gone too far. The burning of the school barn had awakened something in the townspeople, a collective courage born from shared outrage. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her simple dress dusty from the ride into town. She'd spent the night at Hacienda Vega, planning the next day's lessons with trembling hands, trying to maintain normalcy in the face of escalating violence. But this morning, everything had changed. "There she is!" someone shouted, and suddenly Clara found herself at the center of attention. The crowd parted, creating a path, but their faces showed a mixture of emotions: respect, fear, uncertainty. Silas Bragg stood on the wooden platform normally used for town announcements, flanked by his hired guns. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his eyes wild with rage that had fermented overnight. "This woman," he bellowed, pointing at Clara, "has brought nothing but chaos to our peaceful town. She fills children's heads with dangerous ideas, consorts with undesirable elements, and now look, violence in our streets." "The only violence has been yours," a voice called from the crowd. Clara was surprised to see it was Mrs. Henderson from the general store, typically a woman who avoided confrontation. "Silence," Silas snarled. "You've all been bewitched by this Eastern Jezebel, but I'm here to restore order. As of today, anyone who sends their children to her illegal school will lose their jobs, their credit at the stores, their place in this community." The threat hung heavy in the air. Clara could see families exchanging worried glances. Many lived paycheck to paycheck, dependent on credit at the general store, vulnerable to exactly this kind of economic warfare. Furthermore, Silas continued, his voice rising, "I'm placing a bounty of $50 on this woman's capture for crimes against the natural order." Gasps rippled through the crowd. $50 was more than most saw in months. Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Is this what Dusthaven has become? A place where education is a crime, where children learning to read is worth a bounty?" "Shut your mouth, woman," Silas roared. "You've corrupted this town long enough." The sound of approaching hoofbeats silenced him. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching, Ethan Cole, moving with deliberate slowness down Main Street. He dismounted smoothly, his duster swirling around him, hand resting casually near his holstered gun. "That's close enough. Cole," one of Silas's men warned. Ethan ignored him, walking straight through the crowd until he stood between Clara and the platform. $50. Brag. That's all a good woman's worth to you." "Stay out of this," Silas warned. "This isn't your fight." "You made it my fight when you burned my barn," Ethan said evenly. "When you threatened someone under my protection." "Your protection," Silas laughed mockingly. "Just like you protected your wife." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Clara saw Ethan's jaw tighten. His hand twitched toward his gun. The crowd held its collective breath. "That's right," Silas continued, emboldened. "We all know how well you protect women. Cole, Sarah learned that lesson the hard way, didn't she?" "Silas," Clara said sharply, seeing the dangerous stillness that had come over Ethan.
Whatever grievance you have is with me. Leave the past buried."
Buried. Silas turned his vicious smile on her. Like Sarah Cole is buried. Did he tell you how she died? Schoolmarm, how she screamed while...
The rest of his words were lost as Ethan moved. In one fluid motion, he drew his gun and fired, the bullet striking the platform inches from Silas's feet. The crack of the shot echoed across the plaza. "Next one doesn't miss," Ethan said, his voice deadly quiet. Silas's men reached for their weapons, but stopped as they realized the townspeople had shifted. Tom Morrison, Jack Sullivan, Don Alejandro, and dozens of others had formed a protective circle, many with their own weapons drawn. "You think you can stand against me?" Silas screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Against my father. We own this territory." "No," Clara said, stepping beside Ethan. "You control it through fear, but fear only works as long as people stand alone." She looked around at the gathered crowd, seeing faces she'd come to know over the past weeks. Parents who wanted better for their children, workers tired of being under Bragg's thumb, families who'd found hope in education. "I came here as a stranger," Clara continued, her voice carrying across the plaza. "You had every reason to reject me, to maintain the status quo, but you didn't. You sent your children to learn. You risked jobs and security for the chance at something better. That courage, that's what Silas Bragg fears." "Pretty words won't save you," Silas snarled, but his bravado was crumbling as he realized the crowd wasn't dispersing, wasn't backing down. "Then let me speak plainly," Ethan said, holstering his gun but keeping his hand near it. "Clara Whitmore is under my protection. More than that, she's to be my wife. Anyone who threatens her threatens me, and unlike 3 years ago, I'm ready for whatever comes." The declaration hit Clara like a physical blow. She turned to stare at Ethan, but his eyes remained fixed on Silas. Around them, the crowd murmured in shock. "Your wife," Silas laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think marriage will protect her? It didn't protect the last—" "Choose your next words very carefully," Ethan warned, and something in his tone made even Silas pause. The tableau held for a long moment. Silas on his platform with his hired guns. Ethan and Clara at the center of a crowd that had finally found its backbone. The power dynamics of Dust Haven balanced on a knife's edge. "Finally!" Silas spat to the side. "This isn't over. My father—" "Your father is in Santa Fe," Don Alejandro interrupted calmly. "I sent word to him last night about his son's behavior, about the barn burning, the threats to children, the attempt to destroy a lawful school. He was most displeased." Silas went pale. "You're lying." "The telegraph is a wonderful invention," Don Alejandro continued. "William Bragg may be many things, but he's not stupid. He knows the railroad is coming, knows that burning schools and threatening teachers won't look good to Eastern investors. He's ordered you to cease all activities against the school immediately." "No," Silas looked around wildly. "These are my men. This is my town." But his hired guns were already backing away, understanding that without Bragg money behind them, the game had changed. One by one, they melted into the crowd or headed for their horses. "It seems," Ethan said mildly, "that your support has dried up." Silas stood alone on the platform now, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. "This isn't... You can't..." "I believe you have a stage to catch," Sheriff Dixon said, finally finding his courage now that the winds had shifted. "Your father's telegram was quite specific. You're to report to him in Santa Fe immediately." As Silas stumbled off the platform and toward the stage depot, the crowd began to disperse, but Clara barely noticed. She was still processing Ethan's declaration. "Your wife," she said quietly once they had a moment of privacy. Ethan finally looked at her, and she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, but when he threatened you, when he tried to put a price on your head, I—" "Ethan Cole," Clara interrupted. "Are you proposing to me in the middle of a gunfight?"
I suppose I am, he said, a wry smile touching his lips. Though I'd planned something a bit more romantic. You'd planned. Clara felt her heart skip. How long have you been planning? Since you stood up to Silas that first day. He admitted. Maybe since you insisted on learning to shoot. Definitely since you held my hand while my barn burned and promised we'd build something new together. Clara looked at this man, scarred by loss but not broken by it, who'd protected her, supported her, stood with her when it mattered most. You know I didn't come here looking for a husband. And I wasn't looking for another wife. Ethan replied, but sometimes what we're not looking for is exactly what we need. Around them, the plaza was returning to normal. Children played, merchants opened their shops, and life in Dust Haven continued. But different now, changed by the morning's events. I can't give up teaching, Clara said, even for marriage. These children need— I know, Ethan interrupted. I wouldn't ask you to. Sarah wanted to teach. Remember, I failed her in many ways, but I won't fail you. You'll have your school, Clara, a real one this time, built proper and protected. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Is that a proposal, Mr. Cole? It's a partnership, he said, taking her hands. You bring the books and dreams. I'll bring the land and guns. Together, we'll build something neither of us could manage alone. And love? Clara asked softly. What about love? Ethan's thumb brushed across her knuckles. That's already there. Isn't it? Has been for a while now, growing quiet like desert flowers after rain. Clara thought of all the moments that had led to this, the shared glances, the comfortable silences, the way they moved together like dance partners who'd found their rhythm. He was right. Love had crept up on them, disguised as partnership and respect until it was simply there, as natural as breathing. Yes, she said simply. To all of it, yes. Ethan's smile transformed his face, years falling away to reveal the man he might have been before loss marked him. He pulled her close, and there, in the middle of Main Street, kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Cheers erupted around them. Clara had forgotten they still had an audience. She buried her face against Ethan's chest, embarrassed but laughing. Come on, he said, taking her hand. Let's go tell your students they'll have a new schoolhouse soon, and a teacher who's not going anywhere. As they walked together toward Hacienda Vega, Clara marveled at how much had changed in a single morning. Silas Bragg was gone. His reign of intimidation ended not by violence, but by community courage and his father's pragmatism. She'd found not just acceptance in Dust Haven, but a home, a purpose, and a love she hadn't expected. There's still work to do, she said, thinking of all the challenges ahead. There always is, Ethan agreed, but we'll face it together. Together. The word had never sounded so full of promise. As they reached the hacienda and children came running to greet their teacher, Clara knew that this was just the beginning. The real work, building a school, a marriage, a future, lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, with Ethan's hand in hers and eager young faces looking up at her, Clara Whitmore knew she was exactly where she belonged. The Eastern schoolteacher had become a Western woman, and Dust Haven would never be the same. The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful afternoon at Ethan's ranch. Clara, who had been grading papers in the house, immediately grabbed the rifle Ethan had taught her to use, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Through the window, she could see them, 15 men, maybe more, taking positions behind rocks and outbuildings. At their head was Silas Bragg, who apparently hadn't gone to Santa Fe after all. His face was twisted with rage and something else, desperation. Clara, Ethan's voice came from the barn where he'd been working. Stay in the house. But Clara could see he was pinned down, bullets splintering the wood around him. Without hesitation, she took aim through the window and fired, her shot sending one of the attackers diving for better cover. That witch can shoot, someone yelled. and Clara allowed herself a grim smile. The hours of practice were paying off.
"Give up the woman!" "Cole," Silas shouted. "This is between her and me. No need for you to die too." "Go to hell! Brag!" Ethan responded, returning fire.
Clara quickly assessed the situation. They were outnumbered and surrounded. But Ethan had prepared for this possibility, showing her defensive positions, fields of fire, hidden ammunition caches. She moved through the house, firing from different windows to make it seem like there were more defenders. A crash from the back door made her spin around. 2 men had broken through. Clara shot the first one in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. The second rushed her, and she swung the rifle like a club, catching him across the jaw. Tom Morrison went for help. Ethan called out during a lull. "We just need to hold on." But Clara could see their ammunition wouldn't last long enough. She made a decision. Loading her pistol, Sarah's pistol, she slipped out the side door and circled around, using the smokehouse as cover. She could hear Silas ranting. "My father thinks he can just send me away, that I'll bow to his wishes like a dog. I'll show him what a real brag does. I'll burn this whole valley before I'm done." Clara crept closer, using skills she never imagined she'd need. Teaching geometry was one thing, flanking armed men was quite another. But love and desperation made her bold. She was almost in position when a hand grabbed her ankle. One of Silas's men had spotted her. They grappled in the dirt, Clara fighting with a ferocity that surprised them both. The man was stronger, but Clara was fighting for more than just her life. She was fighting for Ethan, for her students, for the future they were building together. The struggle ended when a shot rang out. The man collapsed, and Clara looked up to see young Carlos Reyes holding a hunting rifle, his face pale but determined. "Carlos, what are you doing here?" "My papa sent me to check on Senor Cole's horses," the boy said. "I saw the bad men coming." Before Clara could respond, she heard Ethan cry out in pain. Through the dust and smoke, she saw him clutch his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "No!" The word tore from her throat. Without thinking, she ran toward him, firing at anyone who moved. Bullets whined past her, but rage made her fearless. These men had threatened her students, burned their school, and now wounded the man she loved. Enough was enough. She reached Ethan just as he collapsed behind a water trough. "You damn fool, woman!" he gasped, but his eyes held pride along with pain. "I told you to stay inside." "And let you have all the fun." Clara pressed her hands against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Not a chance. The gunfire intensified. Silas's men were closing in, emboldened by Ethan's injury. Clara could see their ammunition was almost gone. This was it, their last stand. "Clara," Ethan said weakly, "take the horses. Run, please." "We've had this conversation," Clara said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere without you." She fired her last bullets, then picked up Ethan's rifle. 3 shots left. Not enough, not nearly enough. That's when she heard it, a sound that would live in her memory forever. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, thundering closer. Over the ridge came riders. Tom Morrison, Jack Sullivan, Don Alejandro, Sheriff Dixon, and what looked like half the town, all armed and riding hard. "It's over. Brag." Sheriff Dixon called out, apparently finding his courage when backed by numbers. "Surrender now." But Silas had gone beyond reason. With a wordless scream of rage, he charged toward Clara and Ethan. His gun raised. Time seemed to slow. Clara saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the hatred in his eyes, knew she couldn't move fast enough. The shot that rang out didn't come from Silas. He jerked, stumbled, and fell face first in the dirt. Behind him stood his own man, Rodriguez, smoking gun in hand. "I didn't sign up to murder women and wounded men," Rodriguez said simply, dropping his weapon. "It's finished." The remaining attackers threw down their guns, hands raised in surrender. The siege was over. Clara barely noticed the chaos that followed.
Men being arrested, wounds being tended, explanations being given. Her whole focus was on Ethan, keeping pressure on his wound until Doc Patterson arrived. "You'll be fine," the doctor pronounced after examination. "Bullet went clean through. Missed anything vital. You're lucky."
"Luck had nothing to do with it,"
Ethan said, his eyes on Clara.
"I had a guardian angel. An angel who needs to learn to follow orders,"
Clara said, but her voice shook with relief. "Good luck with that," Tom Morrison laughed. "You're marrying the stubbornest woman in the territory." As Ethan was moved inside to recover, Clara found herself surrounded by the townspeople who'd ridden to their rescue. The story came out in pieces. Carlos Reyes had ridden hard to town, raising the alarm. The people who'd once cowered before the Braggs had grabbed their guns and horses, united in purpose.
"You showed us how to stand up,"
Ellen Morrison said, tears in her eyes.
"We couldn't let you stand alone."
Sheriff Dixon cleared his throat awkwardly.
"Miss Whitmore, Mrs.
Cole, I owe you an apology. I haven't been much of a lawman, but that changes today." Don Alejandro approached, his dignified bearing unchanged despite the dust and chaos. "Señorita, what you and Señor Cole did today, it will be remembered. This valley owes you both a debt."
"We don't want gratitude,"
Clara said tiredly.
"We just want peace.
And a school that stays standing for more than a week. You'll have it." Don Alejandro promised, "I've already sent word to William Bragg about his son's final actions. There will be no more interference from that family." As the sun set and the ranch returned to quiet, Clara sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand. He was pale but alert, his gray eyes studying her face. "You could have been killed," he said softly.
"So could you."
"That's different."
"Is it?"
Clara challenged.
"Because I'm a woman, because I'm from the East.
Tell me, Ethan Cole, what makes my life worth more than yours?" "Because I already lost one woman I loved," he said roughly. "I couldn't bear to lose another."
Clara leaned down and kissed him gently. "Then we'll have to make sure neither of us goes anywhere. Deal?"
"Deal." Carlos Reyes appeared in the doorway, still clutching the rifle he'd used to save Clara. "Señor Cole, my papa wants to know if you need anything." "Come here, son," Ethan said. When the boy approached, Ethan extended his hand. "You saved Miss Clara's life today. That makes you a hero in my book." Carlos blushed but stood taller.
"She is our teacher. We protect what matters."
After the boy left, Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks.
"From the mouths of babes,"
she whispered.
"He's right. You know,"
Ethan said,
"you matter, Clara, to those children, to this community, to me, what you've built here."
"What we've built," Clara corrected.
"I couldn't have done any of this without you."
"Sarah would have been proud," Ethan said quietly.
"Of both of us."
"For not giving up, for fighting for something worthwhile." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Through the window, Clara could see riders posted as guards, the community protecting its own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Silas's death would need to be investigated, though, given the witnesses, Clara doubted there would be charges. The school would need to be rebuilt yet again. Their wedding would need planning. But tonight, with Ethan's hand warm in hers and the knowledge that they'd faced the worst and survived, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Dust Haven. True peace.
"I love you,"
she said simply. "And I love you," Ethan replied. "My fierce, stubborn, beautiful teacher."
"Your future wife,"
Clara corrected with a smile.
"That too."
A knock at the door interrupted them. Tom Morrison peered in. "Sorry to disturb, but thought you'd want to know. The town council met in emergency session. They've voted to fund a proper schoolhouse, brick construction, with living quarters for the teacher and her family." "Her family?" Clara asked, confused. Tom grinned. "Well, We figured after that performance today, you two won't be waiting long for the wedding. And after that, well, nature takes its course." Clara blushed furiously while Ethan chuckled, then winced as it pulled at his wound. "Get out, Morrison," Ethan said good-naturedly. "Can't a man recover from being shot in peace?" After Tom left, still laughing, Clara looked at Ethan. "A family," she said softly. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "I have," Ethan admitted. "Children running around the ranch, learning to ride and read in equal measure. A full house again, but this time protected properly." "It sounds perfect," Clara said, and meant it, as she settled in to keep watch through the night. Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Boston as an idealistic teacher, determined to bring education to the frontier. She'd found so much more, a community worth fighting for, a love worth dying for, and a strength within herself she'd never known existed. The schoolteacher from back east was gone. In her place sat a frontier woman, gun oil under her fingernails and chalk dust in her hair, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. And beside her lay a man who'd lost everything once but chose to risk his heart again. Together, they'd survived the storm. Now it was time to build something lasting from the ashes of what had been burned away. Clara smiled in the darkness, her hand still linked with Ethan's, and began to plan lessons for the new school that would rise from the desert floor, a monument to courage, community, and the power of standing together. The morning of Clara and Ethan's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline blue sky that only the New Mexico desert could produce. The new schoolhouse, built of solid brick just as Tom Morrison had promised, stood proudly at the end of Main Street, its bell tower gleaming in the sun. Clara stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the simple white dress she'd ordered from Santa Fe. It wasn't the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but it was perfect for who she'd become, practical yet beautiful, modest yet elegant. "You look radiant," Ellen Morrison said from the doorway. She'd become Clara's closest friend over the past months. "Ethan won't know what hit him." "He's already been shot for me," Clara said with a wry smile. "I think he knows exactly what he's getting into." Through the window, she could see the town preparing for the celebration. Tables were being set up in the plaza, women hanging garlands, children, her students, practicing the songs they'd learned for the occasion. The transformation of Dust Haven was remarkable. What had once been a town ruled by fear was now a community united by hope. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Don Alejandro entered, dressed in his finest suit. "Señorita Clara, if you would permit me the honor, I would like to escort you to your wedding." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Don Alejandro, I would be honored." The old man smiled. "Your parents cannot be here, but you have family nonetheless. This town, these people, we are all your family now." As they made their way to the church, Clara was overwhelmed by the turnout. It seemed everyone in the valley had come to witness the marriage of the schoolteacher and the rancher who'd stood against tyranny together. Ethan waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his new suit, but handsome nonetheless. His eyes found hers across the crowded church, and the love she saw there made her breath catch. Beside him stood Tom Morrison as best man, while young Carlos Reyes proudly held the rings. The ceremony was simple but moving. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone objected to the union, a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. After all they'd been through, who would dare? "Clara," Ethan said when it came time for the vows, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "You came to this town to teach, but you ended up teaching all of us. About courage, about standing up for what's right, about the power of knowledge and community. You brought light to my darkness and hope where I had none. I promise to stand beside you, protect you, and support your dreams as you've supported mine. Together, we'll build something lasting." Clara had to swallow past the lump in her throat before she could speak. "Ethan, you showed me that strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up. You taught me to shoot, but more importantly, You taught me when not to. You gave me a home, a purpose, and a love I never expected to find. I promise to stand with you, to build with you, and to love you through whatever storms may come." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in Santa Fe. Ethan kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes. And then they were swept out into the plaza where the real celebration began. The feast was a testament to the community's generosity. Mexican families had prepared tamales and pozole. Ranch families contributed beef and beans. And the ladies of the town had baked enough pies and cakes to feed an army. Music filled the air, guitars and fiddles playing songs that blended American and Mexican traditions into something uniquely their own. "Mrs. Cole," Ethan said, twirling Clara in their first dance as husband and wife. "How does it feel?" "Perfect," Clara said, then laughed as she stepped on his foot. "Though I'm a better shot than a dancer." "Good thing I married you for your aim, then," Ethan teased, pulling her closer. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself pulled aside by her students. They'd prepared a surprise, a book they'd made themselves, filled with drawings and stories about their teacher and the school she'd fought to create. "We wanted you to remember us," Maria Garza said shyly. "As if I could ever forget," Clara said, hugging each child in turn. Sheriff Dixon approached, looking more confident than Clara had ever seen him. "Mrs. Cole, thought you should know. Got a telegram from the territorial government. They're so impressed with what's happened here. They're sending additional funding for books and supplies. They're even talking about using Dust Haven as a model for other frontier schools." "That's wonderful news," Clara said, though her attention was drawn to a dust cloud on the horizon. A lone rider was approaching. The celebration quieted as the rider drew near. It was a woman, travel-worn but sitting straight in her saddle. She dismounted and looked around at the gathered crowd before her eyes found Clara. "I'm looking for Clara Whitmore," she said. "I mean, Clara Cole." "I'm Clara," she said, stepping forward. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled. "I certainly hope so. My name is Margaret Stevens. I'm a teacher from Colorado. I heard about what you did here, standing up to corruption, building a school against all odds. I've come to learn from you. If you'll have me, there are other towns that need what you've built here." Clara felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder, steady and supportive. "We'd be happy to help," she said, "though I should warn you, the path isn't easy." "The best paths rarely are," Margaret replied. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Clara stood with her husband on the steps of their new schoolhouse. The building that had once been a symbol of conflict was now the heart of a transformed community. "No regrets?" Ethan asked softly. Clara looked out at the scene before her, children playing while their parents talked and laughed, former enemies now working together, a town that had chosen hope over fear. She thought of the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that stagecoach months ago, full of naive idealism and untested courage. "Not one," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I belong." "Even if more trouble comes," Ethan pressed. "The railroad will bring changes, new people, new challenges. Then we'll face them," Clara said simply, "together, the way we always have." As if to punctuate her words, young Carlos Reyes ran up, his face shining with excitement. "Senora Cole, Senor Cole, my papa says I can start learning about horses and books. Both, he says a man needs to know both to succeed in the new world coming." "Your father is a wise man," Ethan said, ruffling the boy's hair. "We'll start tomorrow." As Carlos ran back to the celebration, Clara leaned against her husband, contentment filling her heart. The schoolhouse bell rang out across the valley, not in alarm this time, but in celebration. It was answered by cheers from the crowd, a joyful noise that spoke of community, of triumph over adversity, of futures bright with possibility. "You know," Clara said thoughtfully, "when I left Boston,
I thought I was coming to teach the frontier. I never imagined the frontier would teach me so much in return."
"What did it teach you?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious.
Clara considered. "That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. That community is strongest when it embraces all its members. That love can bloom even in the harshest ground." She looked up at him. "And that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Like a schoolteacher from Boston finding her home in a dusty New Mexico town. Like a grieving rancher finding love again when he'd given up hope."
Clara countered.
They stood together as the stars began to appear, the celebration continuing around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Margaret Stevens to train, lessons to plan, a ranch and school to run together. There would be difficulties ahead. Clara knew. The railroad would indeed bring change. There would be new conflicts, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, surrounded by the community they'd helped forge, bound together by love tested in fire, Clara and Ethan Cole stood ready for whatever came next. The schoolteacher who'd been mocked had become a cornerstone of the community. The lonely rancher had found purpose again. And Dust Haven itself had transformed from a town ruled by fear into a beacon of what was possible when people stood together. As the music played and laughter filled the night air, Clara thought one last time of that scared young woman stepping off the stagecoach. She'd wanted to make a difference, to matter, looking around at the fruits of their struggle, the children who could now read, the families united in purpose, the justice that had prevailed over corruption. She knew she'd succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. The bell in the schoolhouse tower rang one more time, its clear tone carrying across the desert. It was no longer just a bell calling students to learn. It was the sound of hope, of progress, of a future where education and courage could overcome any obstacle. And as Clara turned to kiss her husband beneath the vast western sky, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The best chapters were yet to be written, here in this place where she'd found her true home, her true purpose, and her true love. The town had mocked the schoolteacher until he rode in, crushed her to his chest, and claimed her as his wife. But in the end, it was the schoolteacher who'd claimed them all, binding them together with threads of knowledge, courage, and community that would endure long after the last echo of wedding bells had faded into the desert night. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts about Clara and Ethan's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of courage, love, and adventure on the frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover this story. Your support helps keep these tales alive for everyone to enjoy. Happy trails, partners.